Good afternoon, Mr. Poplett.
Good afternoon.
Now, Mr. Connell.
Right, Lord. Can we go back to 558 of the report, please? I'm just going to ask a question before we kind of moved further through your derogation according to Poplett manual. The argument might be put to you that things like air change rates are just guidance, that nothing more than that, and therefore you shouldn't be taking such a strict approach to whether you comply with them or not. What's your view on that?
My view is that the air change rates were established through evidence-based clinical research that hasn't ostensibly changed. Particles that are released from people, particles that travel in the air, none of these have changed over time. And when you look at the air change rates as a means of measuring the effectiveness of ventilation, I haven't seen anything alternate that is better. So if someone believes that air change rate is not an appropriate metric, then provide evidence-based research of an alternative.
Now, as I say, we're in the middle in terms of where we left off just before lunch of a discussion about derogation and how to manage it. And you deal with this in some detail, some of which we've probably touched on. So if we go on to 560, for instance, you pick up the issue of authority, which you were keen to tell us about earlier, and then definition, and so on. And then you make the point in 9113 that I think you made earlier, that this should not be left to the project team alone. Is that correct?
Correct.
And you've actually given us a diagram on 561, which I won't attempt to go through because I'll probably get lost in a box marked no return. So it's certainly there as a flow diagram, I take it, of the different steps that you would suggest.
It is, and I would say that it is constantly evolving, but it was my attempt to try to provide a graphical representation, which in theory was easier to follow than paragraphs and paragraphs of text. Anyone who's seen the flow diagram may disagree with that, but it was there to, if nothing else, demonstrate the complexities of the decision-making progress that was involved in agreeing or rejecting a derogation.
Now on 562, just after the diagram, you say here are the essential considerations when you're doing the process that you say should be gone through. Now, interestingly, perhaps on that list, is it accidental that patient, staff and visitor safety is at the top and cost is at the bottom?
No, it is not.
And the point that you make, just so we're clear about it, against cost, that reduced capital costs must not be put ahead of whole life or revenue costs. What's your point there?
Something may be cheaper to buy, but more expensive to operate or not last as long as something which is more expensive to buy in the first place, but costs less to run or lasts longer. So it's important that it's not just driven by a capital cost, it should be the whole life cost of an item in operation.
So this is perhaps similar to the argument that we had. If you put in a piece of cheap kit, it may save you a few pounds when you do it, but then the people who have to run it for the next 20 years are struggling.
And indeed, it may well not last those 20 years. It may only last 5 or 7 years rather than 20 years.
Thank you. And then you suggest there should be a risk assessment, is that right?
Yes.
And then on the next page, you set out the kind of records. And the only question I have about that passage of your suggested process is if there is there a risk that if you create Poplett's Guide to Derogations checklist 1, it becomes a kind of tick box and people go, oh yeah, we're sure we've done that, and tick them all off rather than dealing with the substantive issues.
Whenever you produce any checklist, there is a risk that it will get misused or not used as intended. The idea of this is that it tries to document the individuals who have to make an assessment of the derogation, put arguments either for or against, and record whether they believe it should be or shouldn't be supported. So it tries to act as a checklist in that it makes sure everybody has gone through a review process, and the ultimate decision maker, normally or typically an executive director, won't necessarily go into every dot of every I, but will have assurance that that level of detail and consideration has been undertaken, so that they can make an informed decision based on best advice.
Thank you. One of the other points that you picked up a little earlier, and I perhaps just dwell on it for a moment, is in relation to review, because you're perhaps an outside person might think, well, we have to go through this process once. If we go through the process, that's it. We've reviewed it, we've risk assessed it, we've got it signed off by the man at the top. That should be an end of it. So why is review important?
Because hospitals aren't stable environments. We constantly change clinical practice. We constantly change where we undertake clinical practice. The only thing in the NHS that is constant is change. And it is important that if a decision was right at the time when it was taken, then that decision needs to be kept under review to ensure that it still provides a safe and appropriate environment for any activity should it evolve or change over time.
If we go to 565, I think you provide an example of why you need to keep an eye on this, do you? At the foot of that page in 9123. The risk of a temporary facility in effect becoming permanent simply because it's there.
Yes.
Is that right? And you suggest on the next page, 9124, one way of possibly dealing with this need for review, which is putting it on the agenda of whatever the safety group is. Is that right? But your conclusion at the end of that section is that we're right in thinking that the process, at least so far as you saw it, of agreeing a derogation within this project didn't seem to comply with your suggested format for doing it. Okay. Now, what you then have in your report is a document recording form template which relates to that. Is that correct?
It is.
Well, let me move on to a slightly different topic. If we turn to page 570 for ease, just so we know where we've got to, I want to ask you about something a little different in that the inquiry has heard evidence from a number of witnesses about ventilation, some focusing primarily on that and some dealing with ventilation in the course of their evidence on other matters. One of the witnesses we heard from was Mr. Peter Hoffman. I take it that's a name that is known to you.
It is.
Have you had to work with Mr. Hoffman or work on bodies with him before?
I've worked with Peter on the drafting of the current HTM, and I am currently working with him on a number of Hospital Infection Society's supplementary guidance documents currently under production.
Now, I'd just like to ask your view on this. Mr. Hoffman was firmly of the view that, certainly in relation to immunocompromised patients, air change rates, which are in the guidance, weren't important. What was primary important was HEPA filtration, then pressurized room, pressurized ventilation, but air change rates weren't needed. Do you agree with that statement?
No, I don't.
And why not?
Two primary reasons. The first is that to maintain a positive pressure cascade, you require a certain minimum level of ventilation rate, be that measured in litres per second or air changes, to provide both open and closed door protection limits. The other issue where I believe air change rate is fundamental is that if you have an immunocompromised patient in an isolation room with no other sources of contamination within that room, then air change rate is potentially less critical. However, we don't leave patients in rooms by themselves with no other sources of contamination. We all give off tens of thousands of skin scales an hour, all of which are capable of carrying bacteria. Nursing staff, medical staff, wash hand basins are in the room. There are wastewater traps on those. There are any number of sources of potential pathogen released into that room, and air change rates are a fundamental metric to manage and limit their concentration and build-up. So whilst a patient in a positive pressure HEPA filtered isolation room, the air change rate isn't necessarily the primary concern. They aren't in there on their own. They are visited by relatives, by nursing staff, by medical staff, all of which are potential sources of contamination. And that is why air change rate, in my view, is also as fundamentally critical in isolation rooms as the pressure cascade or the filtration rate.
Well, let me move on then to the topic that appears starting on page 570 of your report. And what you're doing in this section, as I understand it, is you're walking through a series of parts of the hospital. You're looking at what the issues were, and you're looking at what steps may or may not have been taken to deal with these issues relating to ventilation. Is that correct?
Correct.
And you start with high dependency unit and intensive care unit. Is that correct?
Correct.
Now, in paragraph 10.4, you record that the first verification, so it was 2019. Now, just pausing there a second, would the HDU and ICU be regarded as a critical care area requiring annual verification?
Yes.
But nevertheless, the first verification was July 2019.
Correct.
And I see you note there that there was a record that the air change rate and pressure cascades failed to meet the required standard for an intensive care unit. Poor pressure cascades from clean to less clean areas. Therefore, several of the systems required rebalancing. Now, in much of the work that the inquiry has been doing, what we've been looking at is problem X. It requires, building works or, changing the air conditioning unit or something of that kind. This is a slightly different question which has been raised, which is something called rebalancing. So can you help us, for the benefit of those who are not engineers, with a simple explanation of rebalancing?
A ventilation system is balanced at commissioning stage to make sure that the right volume of air is distributed around the ductwork system. Rebalancing is basically a review of that exercise where if there is spare capacity on the fan unit supplying it or extracting from it, additional air can be, you can turn the fans up to 100% capacity, and you can provide additional air. If you are looking to increase the overall ventilation rate across the whole system, because the system has been proportionally balanced, so it gives the air changes that are required, and if an upgrade raises all of them, that's fine, you wouldn't necessarily rebalance. If, however, you've got a specific area that is not achieving the required air change rate, then to increase the proportion of air that goes to that grill or branch, you would rebalance it to adjust the overall settings. If there were areas that were less critical than others, you could, to paraphrase, rob Peter to pay Paul and make sure that the critical area received correct ventilation, whilst non-critical areas where ventilation was deemed less critical, that could have reduced ventilation. It is quite frequent that once you see a drop-off in pressure door cascades or pressure drops, a very common feature is to try to put more air in and turn the fan up so you get your pressure back. Unfortunately, most drop-off in pressure cascades is due to fabric losses and leakage. So you put more and more air in, but if the hole it's leaking out of is still too big, you won't get your pressure drop back. So it can be undertaken for the wrong reasons, or people see a ventilation problem and try to fix it with a ventilation solution, where fabric integrity may be the cause of a loss of pressure rather than a failing of the ventilation system.
One witness, I think, suggested to us that the things like PPVL rooms can be higher maintenance than some other solutions because there's more opportunities in the system for something to leak. Is that the kind of leaky seal that you're talking about when you're explaining about the point you make?
Ironically, I would disagree. The advantage of a PPVL is that you do have a lobby that acts as an improvised airlock. So you only have to worry about door protection on a single door that has protection by either the corridor door or the room door. So I wouldn't say PPVLs are more maintenance intensive, but the number of openings, the number of doors, the number of door seals, they all need to be maintained. So in that respect, yes. But from a ventilation perspective, there is an increased resilience because of the availability or presence of a lobby arrangement.
Now, in this case, what you record in paragraph 10.4 is that rebalancing was done by fan speed adjustment, which is perhaps self-explanatory, and repositioning of dampers in both supply and extract systems. Would you just help us understand that, please?
Dampers are used, or volume control dampers are used within a ductwork distribution system to create a resistance to make air go in a given pathway. Air, like most things in life, will always take the path of least resistance. So you use the volume control dampers to create a system resistance that will push air in one given direction rather than another. So in exactly the same way on a water system, you use valves. On a ventilation system, you use volume control dampers.
So why did repositioning the dampers impact on the identified problem in these rooms?
I would surmise that the fan adjustment increased the overall proportional volume of air available, but it had to be readjusted to make that extra air go to where it was required, rather than equally spreading it across all of the outlets on the system.
Now, you then note that subsequent reports reveal that this rebalancing had been done and that things had improved, correct?
Correct.
And then there's a further note about ceiling ventilation grills with a recommendation that they be removed. And was that done as well?
It is lay-in ceiling tiles rather than solid ceilings, and the advice was that the lay-in ceiling could be replaced with a solid ceiling.
You at the end of that section on 10.4, which appears at the top of 571, you say there's been no HEPA filtration added. I wasn't clear whether that was a flaw or not.
This is within the HDU ICU area.
Still the same area we're talking about.
HEPA filtration is not a requirement or recommendation within ICU, HDU areas unless identified through clinical risk assessment.
Thank you. And then in 10.5, you say that there have been some modifications, improvements, but the open bay area remains non-compliant to a minimum air change rate of 10. You have a kind of query there. Is that because you're not sure what the position is?
From memory, I think the information wasn't clear as to whether the air change rate had been calculated from the bed bay area or the total room area. And it should be calculated from the total room area, not just the bed space.
And your conclusion ultimately appears in paragraph 10.6, that the verification reports from 2022 demonstrate satisfactory performance to the minimum recommendations of SHTM 0301. Correct?
Correct.
Now, you were asked a question about the work that you did on this in your direction 5 questions. We'll perhaps just go there briefly. Can we go to page 150, that document? At the foot, and you're asked in relation to 10.6, which is the one we've just looked at, what did the assessment of the relevant room include, for example, air change? And then you reply by that saying, well, it covered a number of things, and then you list them over leaf. Is that a fairly comprehensive collection of what might need to be known about the particular room? Is that right?
Yes.
Thank you. So that was the HDU, complete ICU rooms. Let's go to 4B now, the adult bone marrow transplant. Because this is the area that the inquiry is aware was a late introduction, but when the patient cohort arrived, they didn't stay very long and went back to the Beatson for a bit while some more work was done before ultimately returning. So what you're dealing with in paragraph 10.8 of your report on page 571 is the improvements, increased airflow volumes by upgrading of primary supply fan motor. Is that just a bigger motor to drive the fan?
It's a larger fan. The motor can be increased in size, but also the impeller can be changed depending upon where you are on a specific fan curve.
And replacement of tiled ceiling grids to solid plasterboard ceilings. Works were completed, validated November 17. And then later ceiling ventilation grills replaced with solid ceiling tiles. So all of these, would you agree these are positive improvements?
Yes.
But then you highlight the fact that the air change rate remains non-compliant at, I think, around 6 rather than 10. Is that correct?
Correct.
So we move on from 4B to 4C. Now, we've touched on 4C briefly in the course of earlier discussions. What you're dealing with here are is an area where there was an addition of floor standing HEPA filters that we've discussed that. I won't ask you again about your view about floor standing filters. Ceiling ventilation grills removed, we see in 1015 on page 572. Then we have in 2020, yes, this is the cam-fill filters in the ceiling that we discussed earlier. Your view of these is not a long-term solution.
My view is that air cleaning devices shouldn't be used in place of dilution ventilation as a permanent fix. They can offer short-term benefit. They can offer benefit to internal air quality. But the premise of the HTM is still based on dilution ventilation by fresh air.
Well, let's go on to 573. So we're back in the infectious diseases ward where you've identified which air handling units are involved, which haven't changed. 1020, no HEPA filtration, but none required. And when you say required, I take it you're referring to SHTM requirements.
Correct.
And then we have this question about, well, the pressure is the right direction, but you're not happy with the amount of pascals. Is that correct?
Yes.
And is that the same point we discussed earlier about a figure, let's say it's 1 here. You say that's quite a small amount of pressure. It could alter.
It is extremely small and would be equivalent to neutral pressure rather than either negative or positive.
So your recommendation is something around 5. Why 5? Is there a reason for that?
5 is a measurable level and will ensure correct direction of airflow.
We're then touching on wards 7B, C, and D, respiratory wards, including cystic fibrosis. So again, you identify the plant rooms and whether there's any HEPA filtration. At the top of 574 in paragraph 1023. All right. So this is your comment about things all being interlinked. You say there have been alterations to fan speeds as a consequence of pressure changes on 4C and 5C. So does that mean there's been an accidental change to the fan speed, or is this a fan speed change that has been necessitated by something else?
I couldn't comment on that. I would only assume that it is a deliberate act to increase one area, and it has resulted in increasing the airflows in other areas as well. It would suggest an alteration of fan speed without an adjustment of the proportional balance or rebalance as we described.
And in 1025, you identify a target pressure differential of, I suppose, 1 Pascal, which you say is almost neutral. And that was ultimately achieved. And in 1028, are you just raising a question as to whether HEPA filtration is or is not required for this cohort of patients?
Yes, where you have a respiratory patient population, it would typically be down to an assessment by clinical or IPC to assess whether they had an increased vulnerability to ubiquitous airborne pathogens such as aspergillus.
And you make the same recommendation about the pressure amounts as you've made earlier.
Yes.
Right. Right. Well, moving on then to the next page where you go to the children's ward 2A. And you list a whole list of issues that we know about. And then 2B likewise. And then you list a series of works that were done to 2A. So can we just then go straight on to 577? So where we start to pick up your comment on what has been done. You say the installation, at the foot of page 577, the installation of separate supply and extraction systems remove the risk of cross-contamination. That because it's now a separate system.
Yes.
Next page, 578, provision of duty, standby arrangement, add resilience. So we're back to your 3 Rs, aren't we?
We are.
HEPA filtered air, pressure cascade achieved, MIBG suite. What's that? Paragraph 10.42.
That I would need to go back and check.
It may be my fault. I've maybe missed it in the list of abbreviations which you helpfully provide at the back of your report. No, I haven't missed it. But whatever it is, it's now got its own dedicated system, whereas it didn't have it before. So if you go then to the final section under that, 10.43, your general answer is that having had all this work done, you think the provision is appropriate for that cohort?
I do.
Thank you. Can I ask you a question almost in passing? I'll pick up a question rather that was asked in your direction 5 response. Can we go to 151 of that document, please? And we pick up question 16, which arises from that, or is said to arise from that paragraph. And you're asked, what air change rate do you consider appropriate for the en-suites? That's presumably an en-suite in a PPVL setup.
Correct.
And what's your answer to that?
The air change rate within an ensuite is determined by the room volume of the patient bedroom and the target of achieving 10 air changes per hour.
So it might or might not be the same as in the bedroom itself.
It will almost certainly be different from the bedroom unless the ensuite is the same size as the patient bedroom, which would be extremely unusual.
And does that matter one way or the other, or not?
Well, it does, because the point of a PPVL is to have the room at neutral pressure to the surrounding areas other than that of the lobby or the ensuite. So if you don't draw out sufficient air from the ensuite, and you're putting more air in through the lobby to achieve 10 air changes of the bed space, you will end up with a positive pressure in the bedroom compared to the corridor. You're looking to balance the amount you blow in from the amount you suck out.
Thank you. The next ward that you deal with is the Pediatric Intensive Care Unit, PICU. Again, you note at 1047 that the first verification was July 19. Is the PICU a critical care area requiring annual verification?
Yes, it is.
And again, a note in July 19 saying that the air change rate and pressure cascades failed to meet the required standard. And then an option report comes up with various options. Now, they're talking this time to sequentially balancing the whole unit. So we've had balancing. So what's sequentially balancing?
I interpreted that as just a change of language, but it relates to proportionally balancing. What it may indicate is that they were looking to put the greatest proportion of the air to the most critical areas, which I described earlier as one of the outcomes of a rebalancing process.
Now you say derogations were agreed here for reduced pressure cascades. and therefore you say you end up with a compliant, though derogated system. Have you seen that derogation go through any Poplett style derogation process?
No.
So your conclusion on that particular area is that suitable and generally satisfactory performance is presumably subject to that derogation.
Correct.
So we now come to your, as it were, wrap up of the walk through the various areas that you looked at. 10.52, you acknowledge a significant amount of work, so we're on page 579 now. Significant amount of work, and then a number of areas improved to the point where they're compliant. However, some of them, presumably you're referring there to the CAMFIL circulating filters or the portable HEPAs, involve the use of these systems, about which you have the questions that you've illustrated in your earlier evidence.
Yes.
And then, in fact, what you then do is you instance some NHS England guidance on the use of HEPA filters. Is that right?
Yes.
Which we needn't trouble you to read through. Which brings us then to 583. Potential improvements. To some extent, what we see here, I think, Mr. Poplett, is material which was reflected in the executive summary at the start of your evidence, some of which, therefore, we dealt with at that point. Because what you're saying in 11.1, we've already touched on. And your point in 11.2, presumably, is that all of the issues weren't identified early on.
Correct.
And you make the point in 11.3 that your comments are from a ventilation perspective.
Yes.
And then you produce the list, which I think we've actually already seen. And then it's back to what you do now. And you then repeat essentially the first point is you want this multidisciplinary process, possibly with some external lead or involvement, as we discussed earlier. You agree?
Yep.
And then following that process, obviously, once they've worked out what needs done, it's down to the practicalities. And then 11, if we go to the next page, 585, please. We find that in 11.9, you're suggesting that there needs to be a process for managing derogations. Well, that's probably clear from your earlier evidence on derogations. And you're just making the point there that depending on what comes out of this process, you may need to suspend or remove services from an area in order to fix whatever has been decided to be fixed.
Yes, although again, it needs to be looked at in the whole in terms of, is the clinical risk of interrupting or relocating a service greater to patient or more detrimental to patient outcome than the present system? But yes, from a ventilation perspective, it needs to be improved. If it's got to be improved within its current location, it is unlikely that that could be achieved without causing significant disruption to the clinical area, which could not be done safely with patients in situ.
Yep. Now, let's go to the next page and we come back to a topic that we skated past fairly briefly, which is this thing called BREEAM, where your view is that the design was strongly influenced by a desire to achieve a certain BREEAM rating. Now, is BREEAM something you're familiar with, you've come across before?
I did a few years ago qualify as a BREEAM assessor. Having gone through the training and passed all of the exams, I determined that I did not wish to do BREEAM assessments, but I am familiar with it as a concept.
Now, the first thing you say about is it's not designed specifically for healthcare.
Correct.
What's it designed for then?
All buildings.
And when you say in paragraph 12.1 that it shouldn't be used as a primary performance driver where clinical or infection prevention and control needs could be jeopardized or compromised, is that your view of BREEAM?
It is.
I take it covers a whole range of topics.
It does, yes.
It's not just the kind of topics we've been discussing here.
No, it covers almost every aspect of the environmental implications of a building.
And in fact, what you then do on the next couple of pages is you set out, I assume, a lot of the topics that arise in a BREEAM assessment. Is that right?
Correct.
Everything through water, waste, transport, pollution, and so on. Well, we won't bother reading all of these. Could we just then go to 590? So, this idea of a comparable performance indicator, is it? Is it regarded as a kind of badge of triumph if you get a BREEAM certification by people who build buildings?
That would be a question to ask those people who pursue it. It is an indicator that environmental issues across a whole range of areas were given significant consideration and accommodated within the design and construction process of a building. In that way, it is extremely useful and very powerful. My issue is that a number of the areas do not lend themselves, or in some cases could be contrary to ideal healthcare provision. So if we could have a BREEAM that was specific to hospitals, then that would be wonderful. Or BREEAM needs to be applied without prejudicing the hospital or healthcare function of the facility.
You suggest in paragraph 12.4 that it may be useful to compare buildings that are otherwise almost identical, but healthcare is different.
Yes.
Well, we'll just wrap that section up by looking at 12.5, if we may, on the next page. This is your view as to what it shouldn't be used for, in effect. Is that right?
Yes. You can use BREEAM, but to assess the performance should be against other similar functions. The founding basis of this goes back to 1856. Florence Nightingale, who said buildings and the healthcare environment should do no harm to patients. That's the basis of how I believe healthcare establishments should be measured. Maximise energy and environmental efficiency where practical, but not at the risk of compromising patient safety.
Can you, I think at that point, we've sort of finished dealing with the topics we've largely been covering today. We've dealt with BREEAM. You touched briefly on Cryptococcus, but it wasn't part of your remit to investigate cases of Cryptococcus or anything of that kind, is that right?
Correct.
And am I right in understanding that essentially what you're trying to do is provide some recommendations from your perspective of things that could be done to avoid issues?
Yes.
So that you provide some discussion of what Cryptococcus is. Had you come across Cryptococcus in your experience
Yes, I have.
in healthcare environments?
Yes.
Do you know why you came across it? What was the cause of it or source of it?
The source is always challenging. It stems primarily or largely from wild bird feces, but it is a naturally occurring yeast fungus. So its point of origin can be numerous, to be blunt. It's also highly transmittable by the airborne route as a fungal spore. It can be argued that fungal spores are designed to spread in that manner. So that is my experience with it. And as I think we covered right the way back at the start of today, I was heavily involved in Aspergillus issues, again, a ubiquitous fungal spore, and many of the lessons that apply to Aspergillus also apply to Cryptococcus. But I would stress, I'm just an engineer, I'm not a microbiologist.
So you pick up some features of Cryptococcus from your experience, and then really it's your tailpiece that contains your thoughts on it, which appears at 594. We can just go there. Additional maintenance precautions. Most of these seem to be focused on wild birds, is that right?
Yes.
And probably if we just go to the very last one, I suppose the question of getting people together to talk about it assumes that you know that it may arise from bird feces or other sources of that kind. Because if you don't know about it, then nobody's looking for it. But you would suggest IPC and estates having a regular review on this topic to see if there's anything that needs done, is that right?
Yes, and now typically through the means of the ventilation safety group.
My lord, I have no further questions for this witness.
Mr. Poplett, what I need to do now is to find out whether there are any other questions in the room, as it were. So what I'll do is I'll invite you to return to the witness room, and we should be able to ask you to come back in about 10 minutes, either to answer additional questions or to have it confirmed that there's no other questions.
Just before I go, if it pleases you, I have double checked ATTMA, and it is the Air Tightness Testing and Measurement Association,
Right.
which is a UK-based association. I was being confused between ASHRAE and ATMA, but it's the Air Tightness Testing and Measurement Association.
Let's get that. The air tightness.
Yep.
Measuring.
Testing and Measurement Association.
And Measurement Association.
We love a good an acronym.
And that's UK based, not US based as you originally thought.
Correct.
Right. Thank you for that.
Please stand.
Everything comes from the cost, opposed to the.
Mr. Conlon?
I have a modest number of questions, my Lord. Not necessarily modest questions, but a modest number of questions.
I understand we have some more questions, Mr. Poplett.
And of course, as usual, if you're not able to assist us with the question, please just tell us why and we'll move on. In the course of your evidence, in the course of your report, you touched briefly on humidity control as part of what's provided by a fully functional ventilation system. And you explained why that was important in relation to things like open wounds and so on. A question has arisen. If you're in a patient room, one of the patient rooms, for an immunocompromised patient, and there is a lot of condensation on the window, does that tell you anything about what the ventilation is or is not doing?
It may give an indication on the ventilation. It could also give an indication on the thermal U value of the window as opposed to the walls. Condensation forms where warm, wet air comes in contact with a cold surface. The air reaches a dew point and then condenses moisture out from it. I would not normally expect to see condensation on the inside of any windows or walls within a critical care area.
So if you did, I mean, this is simply information that's being put to me, but if you did see condensation on the inside of a window in a room housing an immunocompromised patient, would that indicate to you that there was some issue that needed attention?
It could potentially give indication that something needs adjustment. It could also indicate that if that condensation was allowed to sit and run down into glazing seals, then that could act as an area where microbiological activity could be promoted.
And purely on the information I've given you in these questions, are you able to say what action would be needed to deal with the issue if you saw it?
Typically, you would seek to raise the air temperature and therefore above the dew point and stop the air condensing onto the hard surface. It's covered within the current HTM 0301 standard when it comes to shutting down ventilation systems during periods of inactivity, such as operating theatres. So there is a requirement to maintain a minimum air temperature to prevent or minimise the risk of condensation forming, because condensation can obviously provide moisture, which certainly fungal spores can use to proliferate.
So I suppose the question then would follow that if you had an issue with condensation, and if that issue wasn't immediately dealt with by one of the routes that you're telling us, there is the possibility, you say, that because the moisture then collects somewhere or goes somewhere, there could be a potential source of spores. Is that right?
Yeah, probably the best analogy I could provide is not a healthcare one, but black mold in bathrooms and press coverage on the poor quality of rented housing with black mold proliferating. That would be an example where moisture has condensed out of the air, seeded into wood chip wallpaper or some other surface that has then led to mold proliferation.
So if in the in the example I've been testing with you, the immunocompromised patient is in the proximity of the non-treated condensation issue. There might be an issue about microbial spores causing a risk.
Yes.
Thank you. We come back to some, away from humidity, back more to ventilation. We know from other information that Ward 2A houses people with particularly dramatic immunocompromised issues, but children. And we know that 4B can house similarly challenged adults. The question then is, if the former cohort have the benefit of 10 air changes, why should the latter cohort put up with 6? Have you a view on that?
My view is that they should both have the benefit of 10.
If we think of your experience of issues arising during the pandemic, and you then envisage a hospital, such as the Queen Elizabeth Hospital, which, unlike many older establishments, is pretty much entirely single room, and assume that the ventilation is up to SHTM standard. So, pandemic, single rooms, SHTM. Would you or would you not expect to get better results about avoiding nosocomial infection in the single room hospital to a traditional hospital?
From the airborne transmission route of potential patient to patient, I would expect it to be significantly improved. However, even in single-bedded ward spaces, staff move from space to space. It would not necessarily eliminate contact transmission, and airborne transmission is not the only route that needs to be considered. But yes, single bedrooms would, if properly and adequately ventilated, likely reduce the airborne transmission route of patient to patient.
In the course of your preparation for your report, have you seen the schematics for Ward 2A as refurbished?
Not that I can immediately recall, but I've seen thousands of pieces of paper.
It's been suggested that there may be the use of shared lobbies between more than one room. Have you seen that?
I have certainly come across that in the past, yes.
And do you have a view as to whether that's good, bad, or indifferent compared to alternatives?
Sorry, it's entirely my fault. I don't think I quite got the question. Have you seen schematics? No. And what is being put is that in the refurbished 2A, bedrooms share, and it was what they shared. I just didn't hear properly.
The shared lobby system. Shared lobby. So instead of a lobby per individual room, the prospect of a shared lobby in some cases.
Okay, thank you.
And I think the witness said he'd come across that in the past, that type of design. Is that correct?
Correct. My feelings or opinions on shared lobbies are that they are inappropriate. The latest version of HBN 0401 Supplement 1 recommends specifically against the use of shared lobbies. The challenge is that the lobby is positively pressured. So if you open the door, you can change and fluctuate the pressures in either one of the bedrooms. So there is a risk of inconsistent pressure cascade. It also means that if you lose the air handling unit supplying that lobby, you lose 2 isolation rooms, not just 1. So it weakens the resilience of the design.
Do you have any view as to whether a positive pressured room for an appropriate cohort of patients is preferable to a PPVL room, i.e. one with a lobby, or not?
The difficulty with a positive pressure room for an immunocompromised patient is that an immunocompromised patient may also have an infection. So if it is purely positively pressured, you are protecting the individual from contracting a new infection, but you are not preventing any infection they have being transmitted back out of the room into a shared area such as a corridor. So if you only have immunosuppressed and there is no risk of them also having an infection, positive pressure is highly effective. If you have an immunosuppressed patient who also may have an infection, then PPVL would be the most appropriate, in my opinion. If you have an infectious patient, the negative pressure room is most appropriate. But if that person is also immunosuppressed, you run the risk that, as well as the infection they've got, you give them something new.
The inquiry has had some evidence about the precise way in which PPVL rooms can be set up, where grills are placed or not placed, and so on. In the course of the preparation for your report, were you able to see all of the various PPVL rooms that were set up in the Queen Elizabeth Hospital, or only some?
I saw some of them, certainly. I couldn't say that I visited all of them.
Good. I think it's been suggested in other evidence that depending on where you set the grills and so on, this can impact on the effectiveness of a PPVL room. Can you answer that generally, or is it not possible?
No, I can't. It was part of the evidence-based research that was undertaken on PPVLs. They looked at the positioning of the pressure stabilizer from the lobby into the room and from the transfer grill from the room into the ensuite facility. And as I said earlier, it is critical when measuring in air changes that you get total room clearance of the air, no dead spots. CFD modelling was undertaken on the projected room, and it was then actually physically built and tested using tracer gas and other methods, and proved that the CFD model was actually very close to the outcome in reality. So the evidence based on where grills should be positioned and the total room air movement across the room has been thoroughly researched and established. The problem comes if you have an intensive care isolation room, you don't have an ensuite facility. A patient in ICU is not in a fit state to go up and use the loo. So you have to position the extract grills in a room which is comparable to where it would be should there be a ensuite. So generally you would always fit low-level extraction with, again, high-level supply above the doorway from the lobby.
Coming back to coming away from the example of ICU, where you don't have the ensuite issue, going back to what might describe as the ordinary case, where there is an ensuite, does your evidence mean that in order to produce the results indicated by both the modelling and the actual testing in an example, you have to set up the arrangement of ingress and egress of air in the way that these tests indicated they should be set up?
Yes.
And if you don't, for some reason, grills are in different places or whatever, that could produce different results.
It could, and it would have to be tested before it was signed off at validation to prove or disprove its efficacy.
I have nothing furthermore.
Very well. Well, I think we've come to the end of evidence for today, but we're looking forward to see you again tomorrow morning, Mr. Poplett. So if I can wish everyone a good afternoon, and we'll resume tomorrow at 10 o'clock with Mr. McKeever, I think, asking questions. So, and I invite you to leave for the moment.
Dad?